So today I want to tell you the story of how living in Afghanistan and some of the experiences I've had there turned me into a very strong supporter of the Second Amendment. And so there was a time when we lived in Mazar-e-Sharif where at different times there was violence and war flared up and battles. It wasn't the most embattled place in Afghanistan at that time. It was more focused, that war was more focused on the city of Kabul, but fighting would break out in various parts of the country, and in the town that we lived in at that time, sometimes things would get violent and different factions would go to war, and there would be fighting and even aerial bombardments sometimes happened, bombs from airplanes, but a lot of it was centered on gunfire and rockets, Chinese and I think Russian made rockets. And the Mujahideen would use those to lob missiles at each other and rockets. And they weren't particularly precise, but they can generally hit an area that they wanted. But often there would be stray rockets that would go somewhere and cause damage, probably in places that they didn't intentionally intend, but the consequences was real. But most of the combat that people experienced was really gunfire and hand-to-hand combat in terms of Mujahideen groups taking over areas of land and certain neighborhoods and actually being on the ground fighting in a kind of upfront and personal with guns, and there wasn't really an air force. Sometimes there was aerial bombardments, but that was few and far between. There wasn't enough resources for that from any of the groups there to do that. But it was really focused on guns and the use of firearms, and I would say not exclusively, but mostly AK-47s. Designed and built by the Soviets and the Chinese versions, and there were Eastern European versions of it as well. But regardless of that, that was most of the fighting took place with firearms. And one time, our neighborhood was in jeopardy of being overrun by another group. We lived in a certain ethnic neighborhood that was under the control of one Mujahideen leader, which was secondarily under control of another Mujahideen leader that controlled a wide area. And so there was an alliance between them, but they had common enemies. And one time fighting flared up for a while, maybe a week or so. And the men in the neighborhood decided to take to the streets and mount a machine gun right in front of my house. And the homes in where we lived were surrounded by 8-foot, 10-foot, or 12-foot high walls, very thick mud. Sometimes they were concrete, but most of them in the town, in the area of Mazar-e-Sharif that we lived, was very thick mud walls, which really were great for stopping gunfire, actually. So, so they decided to mount this machine gun to protect and aim it down the street, because they knew that's the direction that the opposing army would come from, and they went around the neighborhood asking for support, blankets, different things, so that the guys hanging out in the street could stay warm overnight, and food, whatever we could get together to help them out. So I contributed some money. I really didn't have anything in particular to give them, but I gave them some money, and they were able to secure some supplies to keep them comfortable. But I had a conversation with these guys who were mounting the machine gun, and I said to them, I don't know if I really like the idea of you guys mounting it right there, because when this other Mujahideen group comes and you start fighting and you're shooting the machine gun, that's going to be the focus of, they want to take out the machine gun, and as they fire at the machine gun, it's going to be hitting my house, or at least the wall in front of my house. And I expressed my opinion and my concern, and anyway, they mounted it there, and there were many men that were on the streets and spent the night on the streets, ready for battle anytime it came. And indeed, the other army did come and made an effort to come down the street, and they they just shot back, and the other army realized, wait a minute, this is probably not one of the neighborhoods we really want to take over. It wasn't low-hanging fruit for them, so they moved on to other areas of the city. And so that's an experience that I had that I've thought a lot about, and over the years living there and coming back to the United States. And as a result of that experience, that's always been a part of my experience where I processed information about gun ownership and surviving in very difficult times, and what civilians can do to protect themselves when there's no government or police force to protect them. And so these kinds of ideas I've had in my head related to the experiences I've had in Afghanistan. And I remember when I first got back to the United States a couple of years after this particular experience, and at that time, CNN was really the only national cable news network that was out there. And I remember that there was a manhunt. The police in some part of the country, I don't even know where it was, but in some remote location, they were looking for a criminal that had murdered a police officer. And so they were showing clips of the police out there by the edge of the woods, and footage from helicopters of the police trying to search an area, that sort of thing. But I remember the journalist, the way this was presented was that this man that they were looking for was a survivalist. And I remember she mentioned that he was a survivalist, and went on to explain that this guy knew how to survive in the woods and with no infrastructure, and just knew how to find water and food and take care of himself as a survivalist. And that was the way this man was described when he was a criminal and a cop killer and a murderer. And but for whatever reason, there was real derision in the way the story was presented, that this was a survivalist, as if this was the bad thing about this person, and why the government agents should find this guy because he's a survivalist. And I'm trying to describe it as neutrally as I can. That really was my impression of how the story was presented, and it really confounded me that anybody would think this way. After having lived in Afghanistan and seeing what life could really be like in very bad circumstances. And so that was one of the experiences I had that I began processing my Afghanistan experience with. Another issue that came up during the next several years was lots of debate and politicians talking about gun control, and why it's important to control guns and make guns illegal and all kinds of stuff. And the arguments it really never made any sense to me. So I did a deep dive into the issue of gun ownership and the Second Amendment, and really learned a lot that the way gun ownership and the use of firearms is presented in the media is totally skewed and out of proportion, and the politicians that talk about gun control sound like fools when you really process the information and take a deep dive into the use of gun ownership and where guns are most severely restricted and whatnot. But anyway, hearing these arguments for gun control and processing them in my own experience living in Afghanistan was part of my journey of becoming a very strong supporter of the Second Amendment. Now, a lot of my thinking about the Second Amendment and the wisdom of the Second Amendment really isn't focused on what you will hear a lot of pro-gun groups talk about, especially some groups where they talk about hunting rights and sportsmanship and that sort of thing. And that's fine, if they benefit by the Second Amendment for hunting and sporting, I don't have anything against that. And then there are other groups that talk about more like tyranny and fighting the government, having access to firearms to fight the government. And that makes more sense to me than the sportsmanship kind of thing. But really what makes sense to me is when there is absolute civil turmoil, where the government either cannot be trusted or is unable to give protection to a community or to a city or to a group of people, or there's not an adequate police force to deter crime. And to me, the Second Amendment makes a lot of sense, and it really is wise for people to think through this and think through these issues and not just go along with the platitudes that our politicians give of why there should be strong gun control. And one thing, one aside, if this is new information to you, or you've never thought about it this way, or you're in the process of really thinking through what your opinion is, just look up, crime statistics and where most gun violence takes place. The media likes to sensationalize certain things that take place at any given time. I think it really depending on what the other political situation is at the time and what other stories are on the news cycle. They can take an event and really blow it out of proportion, or present it factually and then blow it out of proportion and make inferences of how it's better if we control guns and confiscate guns and do whatever. But if you just do your own research and find where gun crime takes place and where gun violence takes place in America and how that happens and which areas this happens, you might be surprised if you just think it's just a bunch of gun nuts, pro Second Amendment gun nuts that cause all the violence that you hear about. Nothing could be further from the truth. So anyway, that's my story about living in Afghanistan in one time where me and my family personally experienced the benefits of deterring enemies who would seek to come into our neighborhood. And basically, if that army would have come, there'd be a lot of ethnic violence, and there'd be a slaughter, a massacre of the people on our street and in the nearby areas. So anyway, if you have any questions or comments, if you want to chime in, I'd love to hear what you have to say. And if you have any questions, I'll address them in a future video. Thank you.